So the challenge then, in being practical about this, Dan, is we've suggested that the agreement and consensus on what strategy is a pain. Whether we've been able to cascade that or not is another matter. Whether we've established fair accountability is something else. So what's your how do we actually assuming that we've just got we're talking just about change initiatives, we've got to make decisions about what we physically actually allocate leadership time, funds, and resources to.
Mhm.
So the rubber's hitting the road now. We've had the strategist view, we've had the PMO view. I think you sit in the middle. What's your view?
Okay, so I've got a few slides I was pulling together as earlier as we were chatting, and if I can share screen, I will.
I
I
will
said I
just
wasn't going
do that. I think I can just stop sharing mine.
to. Oh
How do I
no,
do that?
it,
Share. I'll just can you access Dan? Can't.
no, don't worry. I'll just talk if it's a problem. Um, so look, for a start, I think one of the things we need to kind of recognise is that you've got prioritization is a number of different processes. And to name but three, you've got strategic planning, budget setting, and project prioritization, all of which are prioritization. Um, they're all kind of own that, those three tags would sit with different bits of the organization. But effectively, they're all doing the same thing at a conceptual level. And what you need to start with, you need to have some continuity between those three things in order to get some consistency in your behavior, because what you can't do is any one of those things in isolation and just let the other ones go on and do their thing as normal, because you're not then getting that kind of system benefit. So
You
accepting.
might be able to share Dan now. I think you might be
Oh
able if you wanted to. Give it a go
no,
if you want to.
this is fine. They're very basic ideas, but so that if we think of what are the common ingredients that kind of persist between those three different labels, um, I think you need to think about value, constraints, alternatives, and authority. Um, and what you're doing here effectively, it's a multi-criteria decision-making kind of challenge, right? You are getting a complicated decision and trying to break it down into a series of smaller, slightly less complicated, more solvable decisions. So we start, as I say, the first step is thinking about those different levels, the kind of really big picture to the more operational one. The second is starting to kind of decompose it into those four bits. So obviously, if you look, if I could share, you'd be seeing my wonderful slides right now that I just built. But we take it one by one. So if you think of value as a start point, you need a definition of value that is quantifiable, non-fuzzy, specific, but also is more than just ROI or some kind of made-up financial number that's a kind of function of a sort of hokey business case that no one really believes in. So what you need to do is, and the way I tend to sort of talk about this is, every executive on a selection panel, governance committee, whatever, has their preferences of what they think we should be doing, why we think we should be doing it. And these are, they might be in the front of their brain based on kind of purposeful, what based on recency bias. It might be their personal experience. It might be some subliminal kind of experience built up. They don't even know it's a bias. Those preferences are in their minds. And the first step in prioritization has to be to get those preferences and articulate them, to get them into the open. And then once they're in the open, the challenge is around building alignment within the group. So the leadership group, whatever level leadership means in that kind of that hierarchy, can be listened to, can collaborate. And what I think Kieran was alluding to this, try to decompose the sort of debate about what should we do and separate it into why should we be doing stuff? What are the criteria we have for investing in anything? Um, and in building that framework and that common understanding, you are starting to define value. As you define value, you can start to then step towards having a quantified, scalable solution. So define value. And again, that has to be specific to an organization. It has to be its own language. It has to be its own terminology. It has to be its own strategy. But it normally comes down to some combination of financial stuff, strategic stuff, operational, risk mitigation, and stakeholder kind of factors. So the second thing you need to articulate, and again, this is just starting to try and quantify things, should be easier to quantify, I suppose, is constraint. And I think Veronica was saying this, it's never worked anywhere where there's, everyone's fine, it's all good, bring on the next project. Because frankly, if that is your circumstance, you don't need to prioritize, right? You probably need to do some business development. But the point is, you need to understand the limits that stop you doing all the projects, and you need to understand them in a systematic way. So you need to understand the budget, you need to understand the resource, you need to understand some of the subtler stuff around change fatigue and the fact that you can't just dump 10 initiatives on the same team at the same time. You need to understand some of the very subtle constraints around brand permissions. What sort of stuff do people kind of accept that we can do? You need to understand risk appetite. Are we willing to back a load of high risk projects, or do we need a kind of balanced portfolio? So we've got value, we've got constraints, then you need alternatives. And again, I call them alternatives because what they are will change depending on where you are in that scale. So if you're in the ivory tower doing your strategic planning, you might be prioritizing divisional investments, big, what do you call them, David? Big fistfuls of money to big fistfuls of money going between kind of different parts of the organization. And then you let it cascade. You're in kind of sort of product space. You might be sort of, balancing out between your products. Which ones do we do? Which ones do we kind of like run tighter and put less into? Or you might be in a kind of portfolio level where you're looking at a backlog and figuring out what to work on. And again, it's really important that you've got a clear understanding of the remit, because then you build the data to deliver against that. And if you're talking about prioritization rolling from up high to down low, this probably isn't a one-time hit. There'll be wheels and wheels, sort of Russian doll style. So you might need to prioritize once at the high level and then once or twice even more operationally. And as you think of your solution, the solution has to match the level and it has to match the value. So one thing, I've got some ideas and lessons, but avoid the overkill solution, but avoid thinking that really high level corporate stuff is simple and applying simple solutions. So make sure that the thinking and the effort and the analysis matches the value and the scale of the challenge. And then finally, you need to think about authority. Now, authority there's two sort of varieties of authority. One is what you might call the formal authority, which is your permission to say no, or indeed permission to say not yet, because there's a time component to this. And then there's the kind of cultural authority, the kind of buy-in element, which says it's a permission to say people can be willing to hear no because they trust the process, and that's really important. So, as I said, permission is this authority has to be kind of, it's a hard kind of governance-y permission, and it's a soft kind of, it's a sort of cultural thing. Probably running out of time, aren't I? But I will just, I think you wanted to give some sort of war stories, didn't you? But I'll give you a smorgasbord of along that framework of things that have worked and things that haven't worked. But value, I've seen clients go, well, it's really good. I was chatting to someone the other day, said, we all, after you came and talked to us, we all just had a chat together. We said we all wanted to hold hands and jump. It was this kind of acceptance that as a group they wanted to commit to doing it because it felt like the right thing for them to do. On the flip side, I've had work with clients who are like in their PMO a bit scared to talk to leadership and trying to kind of guess what leadership want and sort of back into it via some slides they've got, and sort of they don't really want to bother people, and it doesn't really work then, does it? Because it's sort of, it's pin the tail of the donkey with a blindfolded a donkey on roller skates. So then you've got constraints, right? Constraints. Where does it work really well? When you look at your constraints and go, oh dear, we've got this team here who are going to be 1,000% capacity if we go ahead with this plan as it is. ... We should probably sort that team out as our first project. because otherwise we're just going to put all the projects in the poo from the day one, because they all share this kind of common little kind of team requirement that's sort of hidden in the plan. Flip side of that, I spoke to someone. Funnily enough, this was a client that never became a client. Go figure. It's like, yeah, we don't really look after that team. If that's another team, we don't know what, because we don't know what resource they use. We just like to prioritize it, and then they'll do it. It's their job, so they need to worry about it. So no visibility of the resource needed to deliver the work as a function of very silo-based approach to delivering projects is a bit of a killer. Alternatives, where does that go wrong? Well, actually, the worst thing you can do is people think it's boring to do scoring. It's like, oh, I've got to score projects, or people try and game the system. So it's like, oh, I just shove a number in there, tick, 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 admin, admin, admin. So if people don't buy into the fact that you're actually reviewing projects, it doesn't work. If people buy into it, and particularly buy into the idea of working together to come up with better solutions, it's great. And finally, authority. Again, my favorite feedback on this was one client who said, oh, we like this review. Even when people didn't like what it said, they trusted it. And they almost like the computer says no, rather than PMO says no, rather than like the guy in the next door office has nicked all the resources. This was, it's fair, it's honest, and you've got as good of a chance of getting stuff out of it as the next guy. But we all recognise that we can't have everything. So it's a sort of honest broker approach to data telling us the outcome. Versus the loud, I think of this as the loudest voice fights back. So I've lost clients before who'll come back and they'll say, oh, blah, 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 blah. And then you look at it inside, you go, basically the people who you were trying to shut up have put their head down for a bit. They've let you do your thing, and then they found a way of fighting back because they don't like someone telling them they can't have their stuff. And they just want a nice, simple solution, which basically means you do what I tell you. And if they can't be brought into the camp or excluded altogether, then often, those people want to try and find a way of bringing you back to the old school of loudest voice politics, non-data led prioritization or non-prioritization.
Well, thanks, Dan. There's lots to unpack there, but has anyone got? Gregor had a question that might wait till the end. I don't know, but one thing that's in my head is you've talked about prioritizing projects. You've not talked about prioritizing objectives.
Yeah, probably less in my bailiwick, but the concepts is true. I mean, as I said, think of we've done stuff where you're sort of prioritizing maybe kind of real high level stuff like divisions and you're doing the kind of or between portfolios. Prioritizing objectives, yes, you can obviously. I mean, that to some extent, if you're talking about corporate objectives, that's what I would think of as the kind of weighting. I probably should mention that. That's sort of the weighting between those criteria that then define your value. Because again, we talk about alignment. If this guy thinks finance is all important, this guy thinks strategy is all important, and this guy thinks people is all important, they can't all be right unless everything's sort of in the middle, which it rarely is. So you do need to you need to understand which bits of the strategy, if you like, keep the CEO up at night, and which bits of the strategy were sort of shoved in to keep the HR director happy, but when push comes to shove, no one's got any intention of investing much behind them. So, the sort of, and most strategies have that, right? Because most strategies have to have a bit about being green or a bit about people. Half the time it's really true and they believe it, maybe less than half, but some of the time it's true and they believe it. And some of the time it's tokenistic and it isn't important to prioritization. And prioritization needs to be real and not tokenistic.
I guess some of those drivers that we have that we score initiatives against that sometimes have owners of them, sometimes they don't. Mm-hmm. So when they don't have an owner, you kind of wonder who's accountable for that driver.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need the whole thing. It's not really you need ownership through. I mean, that talks about prioritization or talks about delivery, right? You've got to have a culture around accountability, And again, the sort of golden thread I would sort of bang the drum on this on is that continuity between the reasons you said you needed the money and the results you get from spending the money. And recognizing it's not a game. If you let it be a game up here, then you're going to have, whatever happens, but it's not. You've not got that golden thread. You've not got that clarity. So you've got to hold people to account to say this is your business case. The business case is the basis for being prioritized. Show me the results, which can be hard because you have to put non-quantifiable components into a prioritization exercise. The strategy, the risk mitigation, and all that sort of thing. But I think this is more into your BI than your prioritization space. But you have to be inventive and purposeful about how you get that measurement. And that has to be cultural. And like, you can't just say, well, measurement is something we do at the end after we've done all the work and we sort of tag it on at the last. You actually have to bake it into the plan. So an obvious application is if you're doing kind of pilots and things. Pilots slow down delivery, don't they? Because you have to faff about with A/B testing and small groups and things and measurements, and you have to find an analyst and blah blah, boring. We could just do it, couldn't we? So and again, if you've got a 10K project, then you're not going to faff around doing 5K's worth of analysis on it to prove it's a good idea. But if you are spending large amounts of cash or doing something you're going to scale incrementally, it's worth putting time in to measure it properly.